The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the luxury piano showroom in downtown Manhattan, casting golden light across rows of gleaming instruments that cost more than most people's houses. Marcus Chen stood near the entrance, his worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, his faded jeans and scuffed sneakers making him look completely out of place among the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers. He had walked past this store dozens of times over the past 3 years, always stopping to look through the window at the magnificent concert grand pianos inside, but he had never actually stepped through the door until today. Marcus was 28 years old, working 2 jobs to pay off his student loans and keep a roof over his head in one of the most expensive cities in the world. By day, he delivered packages for a courier service, running up and down apartment building stairs with boxes and envelopes, barely making enough to cover his rent in a tiny studio apartment in Queens. By night, he worked as a dishwasher at an upscale Italian restaurant in Midtown, scrubbing pots and pans until his hands were raw and wrinkled. Between both jobs, he pulled in just enough money to survive, with maybe $50 left over each month if he was lucky and didn't have any unexpected expenses. What nobody at either of his jobs knew, what none of his neighbors or casual acquaintances had any idea about, was that Marcus had spent 15 years of his life training to become a concert pianist. From the age of 5 until he turned 20, music had been his entire world. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 4, had been a piano teacher in Taiwan before immigrating to America. She had recognized something special in Marcus, the first time his tiny fingers touched the keys of her old upright piano. She had sacrificed everything to pay for his lessons with the best teachers she could find, working 3 jobs herself to afford his training. Marcus had been what people in the classical music world called a prodigy. By age 10, he was performing pieces that most adult pianists struggled with. By 15, he had won several prestigious youth competitions and had been accepted into Juilliard on a full scholarship. His teachers said he had a gift that came along once in a generation, a combination of technical precision and emotional depth that made even the most familiar pieces sound like they were being discovered for the first time. Everyone who heard him play said the same thing, that he was destined for greatness, that he would perform in the finest concert halls around the world, that his name would be spoken in the same breath as the legendary pianists of history. But life had other plans. During his junior year at Juilliard, his grandmother had a stroke. She survived, but the medical bills were catastrophic and she needed round-the-clock care. Marcus had no other family, no one else who could help. He made the decision that tore his heart in half. He withdrew from Juilliard and took the first job he could find to start paying the bills. His grandmother begged him not to sacrifice his future for her, but Marcus couldn't live with himself if he abandoned the woman who had given up everything for him. Over the next 8 years, Marcus watched his dreams slip further and further away. His grandmother passed away 3 years after her stroke, but by then, the debt was overwhelming. He had missed his window in the classical music world. The competitions he should have won, the connections he should have made, the performances he should have given, all of that had gone to other pianists who had been able to stay on track. In the classical music world, timing was everything, and Marcus had lost his moment. He stopped playing piano completely. It hurt too much to sit at a keyboard knowing what he had given up, knowing what he could have been. He sold his grandmother's upright piano to help pay for her funeral. For 3 years, he hadn't touched a piano, hadn't even listened to classical music. He built walls around that part of his life and tried to convince himself that he could be happy just surviving, just getting through each day. But lately, something had been changing inside him. He would walk past this piano showroom on his delivery route, and despite himself, he would stop and look. He would see people inside testing out the pianos, running their fingers clumsily over the keys, and he would feel something stirring in his chest that he thought he had buried forever. It wasn't ambition or dreams of fame anymore. It was something simpler and deeper, a pure longing just to touch the keys again, just to feel that connection between his hands and the music one more time. Today, on his lunch break from the courier job, Marcus had finally given in to that longing. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside, immediately feeling self-conscious about his appearance. A saleswoman in an elegant black suit looked up from her desk, and Marcus could see the judgment flash across her face as she took in his delivery uniform and backpack. She didn't get up to greet him. Instead, she called out from across the showroom in a tone that made it clear she thought he was wasting her time. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment, but he had come this far. He cleared his throat and said quietly, "I just wanted to look at the pianos if that's okay." The saleswoman exchanged a glance with her colleague, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who was standing near the back of the showroom. They both had the same expression, a mixture of annoyance and amusement, as if Marcus was a child who had wandered into a place where he didn't belong. The man walked over, his shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor, and looked Marcus up and down with barely concealed contempt. "These are very expensive instruments," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The piano you're standing next to costs $150,000. I'm not sure this is really the right place for you to be browsing. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with humiliation, but before he could respond, the man continued speaking in that same patronizing tone that made it clear he had already decided Marcus was nobody worth his time. The salesman gestured toward the magnificent black concert grand piano that stood in the center of the showroom like a work of art, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light above it. This was clearly the crown jewel of the store, positioned where everyone who entered would see it first. A statement of luxury and excellence that most people could only dream of owning. "This is a Steinway Model D Concert Grand," the salesman said, running his hand along the piano's edge with obvious pride. "It's the same model used in virtually every major concert hall in the world. We just received it last week and I already have 3 serious buyers interested. The sound quality is absolutely unmatched, the touch response is perfect, and the craftsmanship is flawless. But of course, an instrument like this requires a player who can actually appreciate what they're getting." The words hung in the air like an insult, though the salesman's tone remained superficially polite. Marcus understood exactly what was being communicated. This piano was not for people like him, not for delivery drivers in faded jeans who wandered in off the street during their lunch break. This piano was for wealthy collectors, for established musicians, for people who belonged in places like this. The salesman was making it abundantly clear that Marcus should leave before he embarrassed himself further. But something inside Marcus had shifted the moment he saw that piano. It wasn't pride or anger that rose up in him, though he certainly felt both of those things. It was something deeper, a recognition that awoke in his chest like a sleeping giant opening its eyes. He knew this piano. Not this specific instrument, but this model, this exact type of Steinway Model D. He had performed on pianos just like this one in competition halls and practice rooms at Juilliard. He knew the weight of its keys, the richness of its bass notes, the crystalline clarity of its upper register. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The saleswoman had joined them now, standing beside her colleague with her arms crossed, both of them clearly waiting for Marcus to accept his dismissal and leave. But Marcus didn't move. He stood there looking at the piano, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to play, to pour everything he was into music, to lose himself completely in the conversation between his hands and the instrument. The longing that had been building in him for months suddenly became overwhelming, impossible to ignore or push down. "How much did you say it costs?" Marcus asked quietly, his eyes still on the piano. The salesman let out a short laugh, as if Marcus had just told a joke. $150,000, he repeated slowly, emphasizing each word like he was speaking to someone who didn't understand numbers. "Plus taxes and delivery, you're looking at close to $165,000 total. Like I said, this probably isn't what you're looking for. We do have some smaller upright pianos in the back room that are more, shall we say, accessible for someone on a budget." Marcus finally looked away from the piano and met the salesman's eyes. "What if I could play it?" he asked. "What if I could sit down right now and play something on that piano?" The salesman's expression shifted from condescension to amusement. He exchanged another glance with the saleswoman, and Marcus could see they were both trying not to laugh. This was clearly the most entertainment they had had all day. Watching this nobody in delivery clothes suggest that he could actually play their precious piano. The salesman was enjoying himself now, sensing an opportunity to humiliate Marcus even further while demonstrating his own authority and control over this space. "Oh, you play piano?" the salesman asked with exaggerated interest, his tone making it clear he didn't believe Marcus could play anything more complicated than chopsticks. "Well, I'm afraid we don't usually let people test our instruments without a serious purchase inquiry. These pianos need to be maintained in perfect condition, and we can't have just anyone touching them. I'm sure you understand." But then something seemed to occur to the salesman, and a smile spread across his face that made Marcus's skin crawl. It was the smile of someone who had just thought of a way to make a boring afternoon more interesting, someone who was about to enjoy watching another person fail. The salesman walked over to the piano bench and pulled it out slightly, then turned back to Marcus with that same cruel smile. "Actually, you know what? I'll make you a deal," the salesman said, his voice taking on a tone of false generosity. "If you can sit down at this piano and play something, anything really, without making a complete fool of yourself. If you can play one piece all the way through without any major mistakes or stopping, I'll sell you this piano for $150,000 cash. Not 165 with all the extras, just 150 even. That's a $15,000 discount right there. The saleswoman's eyes widened slightly, and she opened her mouth as if to object, but the salesman held up his hand to silence her. He was clearly confident that Marcus would fail, that this would be a harmless bit of fun that would end with Marcus slinking out of the store in shame. And then they would have a funny story to tell their colleagues about the delivery guy who thought he could play a Steinway. The salesman was so certain of the outcome that he was willing to offer a steep discount on a piano that Marcus obviously couldn't afford anyway. Of course, the salesman continued, walking closer to Marcus and looking down at him with that insufferable smile. When you can't do it, when you sit down and realize you have no idea what you're doing, you leave immediately and you don't come back. No more window shopping, no more wandering in here on your lunch breaks. You accept that this world isn't for you and you move on with your life. Does that sound fair? Marcus stood very still, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew exactly what was happening. This man was setting him up for public humiliation, creating a situation where Marcus would be forced to either walk away now or sit down and prove that he was exactly the nobody this salesman assumed he was. It was a trap designed to put Marcus in his place, to remind him of the vast distance between his current reality and the world of luxury and refinement that this showroom represented. But the salesman had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Marcus was just another dreamer, just another person who wished they could play piano but had never seriously studied. He had looked at Marcus's clothes and his job and his age, and he had made a judgment about who Marcus was and what he was capable of. He had no way of knowing about Juilliard, about the competitions, about the 15 years of intensive training, about the gift that Marcus's grandmother had recognized when he was 5 years old. He had no idea who was really standing in front of him. Marcus looked at the piano, then back at the salesman. "Okay," he said simply, "I'll do it." The salesman's smile grew even wider, and he gestured toward the piano bench with an exaggerated flourish, like a game show host presenting a prize that the contestant would never actually win. The saleswoman had pulled out her phone and was holding it up, clearly planning to record this moment, so they could share it later with friends and laugh about the delusional delivery guy who thought he could play a $150,000 piano. A few other people in the showroom had noticed the commotion and were drifting closer, curious about what was happening. Marcus walked slowly toward the piano, his sneakers squeaking softly on the marble floor. With each step, he felt layers of the person he had become over the past 3 years beginning to peel away. The exhausted delivery driver, the invisible dishwasher, the man who had learned to make himself small and unnoticed, all of that was falling away with each step closer to the instrument. By the time he reached the bench, he could feel his hands beginning to remember, his fingers flexing unconsciously in patterns they had practiced 10,000 times. He set his backpack down carefully beside the bench and sat down, adjusting his position until he found the exact distance from the keys that his body remembered. The bench height was perfect, exactly what he needed. He placed his hands on his thighs for a moment, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. He could hear the salesman behind him making some comment to the saleswoman, probably something snide about how long Marcus was taking to work up the courage to embarrass himself. Marcus opened his eyes and looked down at the keys. They were perfect, pristine white and black rectangles that held infinite possibilities. For 3 years, he had convinced himself that he could live without this, that he had made peace with the sacrifice he had made for his grandmother, that music was just something from his past that no longer had any hold on him. But sitting here now, with his hands hovering over the keys, he realized he had been lying to himself every single day. This was who he was. This was what he was meant to do. Everything else had just been survival. He placed his fingers on the keys, and the moment he felt that familiar smooth coolness against his skin, something unlocked inside him. His hands knew exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly how to coax the sound he wanted from this instrument. He didn't need to think about it or plan it. His body remembered everything, stored in muscle memory so deep that 3 years of silence hadn't erased it at all. Marcus began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex pieces in the piano repertoire. It was the piece he had performed at his final competition before leaving Juilliard, the piece he had played for his grandmother in her hospital room 2 weeks before she died, the piece that contained everything he had ever felt about love and loss and beauty and grief. His fingers moved across the keys with absolute confidence, executing the rapid passages and delicate phrasings with a precision that came from years of dedicated practice. The opening was quiet and contemplative, almost hesitant, like someone gathering courage to tell a difficult truth. Marcus's touch was so controlled that each note rang out with perfect clarity, building a foundation for everything that would follow. The salesman's smile had already begun to fade. He had expected fumbling, wrong notes, maybe a child's rendition of a simple melody. What was coming from the piano was something else entirely, something that made it immediately clear that a serious musician was playing. As Marcus moved into the first explosive section, his hands flying across the keys with breathtaking speed and accuracy, the entire showroom fell completely silent. The saleswoman's phone was still recording, but her expression had changed from amusement to shock. The other customers had stopped their conversations and were turning to watch. Even the salesman had taken a step back, his face now registering confusion and something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding that he had made a terrible mistake. Marcus was no longer thinking about the salesman or the bet or anything that had happened in the past 3 years. He was inside the music now, in that place where nothing else existed except the conversation between his hands and the piano. The Steinway responded to his touch like it had been waiting for him, producing sounds that ranged from thunderous and dramatic to whisper-soft and heartbreaking. This was what the piano was built for, not to sit in a showroom as a status symbol, but to be played by someone who understood its capabilities and could draw out its full voice. The piece moved through its various sections, each one building on what came before, creating a narrative arc that Chopin had intended to mirror the structure of a spoken story. There were moments of triumph and moments of despair, passages of incredible technical complexity and passages of simple, profound beauty. Marcus played it all with the kind of interpretation that only comes from genuine artistry, making choices about tempo and dynamics that revealed his deep understanding of the music's emotional content. His eyes were closed now, and there were tears running down his face, though he wasn't aware of them. He was crying for his grandmother, who had believed in him when no one else did. He was crying for the dreams he had given up and the person he had been forced to become. He was crying for all the music he hadn't played in 3 years, all the beauty he had denied himself because it hurt too much to remember what he had lost. But mostly he was crying because in this moment, sitting at this piano in this showroom, he was home again. The piece built toward its dramatic climax, and Marcus's entire body was engaged in producing the sound, leaning into the fortissimo passages, his arms and shoulders and back all working together to create the power the music demanded. The piano sang and roared under his hands, filling the showroom with sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the instrument itself, something channeled through Marcus from a source that transcended technical skill. And then, after nearly 10 minutes of continuous playing, Marcus reached the final section. The fury and passion of the climax gave way to something quieter and more resigned, a gentle descent back to earth after soaring through emotional heights. His hands moved more slowly now, coaxing the last phrases from the piano with a tenderness that made several people in the small crowd that had gathered wipe at their own eyes. The final notes hung in the air like a question that had no answer, fading slowly into silence. Marcus held his hands on the keys for a moment after the sound had completely died away, his head bowed, his breathing heavy. Then he lifted his hands and placed them back in his lap. He opened his eyes and stared at the keys, not yet ready to turn around and face whatever was waiting behind him. The showroom remained absolutely silent. Nobody moved or spoke. Even the ambient sounds of the city outside seemed to have faded away, leaving only the aftermath of what they had just witnessed. Marcus finally turned around on the bench, and what he saw made his heart skip. The small crowd that had gathered was much larger than he had realized. At least 20 people were standing in a semicircle around the piano, and every single one of them was staring at him with expressions of pure astonishment. Several people had their hands over their mouths. An elderly woman in an expensive coat was openly weeping. A young couple was holding each other, both of them looking shaken by what they had just heard. The salesman was standing exactly where Marcus had last seen him, but his face had gone completely pale. All the smugness and condescension had drained away, replaced by a look of horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The saleswoman had lowered her phone, and she was staring at Marcus like she was seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the person in the delivery uniform with the musician who had just produced sounds that most people only hear in the finest concert halls. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then someone in the back of the crowd began to clap, and within seconds the entire group erupted into applause. It wasn't polite appreciation or obligatory recognition. It was the kind of applause that comes from genuine emotion, from having witnessed something extraordinary and unexpected. People were clapping and shaking their heads in disbelief, looking at each other as if to confirm that what they had just experienced was real. Marcus stood up from the bench slowly, his legs shaking slightly from the adrenaline and emotion. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, suddenly embarrassed by the tears, and looked at the salesman. The man was still frozen in place, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. His colleague, the saleswoman, had set down her phone and was staring at him with an expression that clearly said she knew they had both just made a catastrophic error in judgment. An older gentleman pushed through the small crowd, walking quickly toward Marcus with an expression of urgent excitement. He was in his 70s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He moved with the kind of authority that suggested he was someone important, someone used to being listened to. When he reached Marcus, he grabbed his hand and shook it vigorously, his face animated with genuine enthusiasm. "Young man, that was absolutely extraordinary," the older gentleman said, his voice carrying a slight European accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. "I have attended concerts at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center for 40 years, and I can count on one hand the number of performances that moved me the way that just did." "Who are you? Where do you perform? I must know." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I don't perform anywhere," he said quietly, pulling his hand back gently. "I used to study music, but that was a long time ago. I'm just a delivery driver now." The older gentleman looked at Marcus like he had just announced he was an alien from another planet. "A delivery driver?" he repeated, his voice rising in pitch. "That's impossible. Nobody plays Chopin like that without serious training at the highest level. You studied at a conservatory, yes? Juilliard, Curtis, where?" Before Marcus could answer, another man stepped forward, younger than the first but equally well-dressed. He introduced himself as a music producer who had been in the showroom looking at pianos for his recording studio. "I recorded that on my phone," he said, holding up his device. "I hope you don't mind, but I've never heard anything like that outside of a professional recording. You have to let me help you. We could record an album, book performances. This kind of talent shouldn't be wasted." More people were pressing forward now, all of them wanting to talk to Marcus, to offer him opportunities, to understand how someone who looked like a random delivery driver could play like one of the greatest pianists in the world. Marcus felt claustrophobic suddenly, surrounded by all these strangers who 5 minutes ago wouldn't have given him a second glance, but now wanted a piece of him because of what his hands could do. A piece of him because of what his hands could do. The salesman had finally found his voice. He pushed through the crowd, his face now flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and what looked like anger at himself. "Sir," he said, his voice much quieter and more respectful than it had been before, "I need to apologize. I clearly made a terrible error in judgment. I had no idea you were such an accomplished musician. If I had known, I never would have spoken to you that way." Marcus looked at him steadily, and in that moment the salesman realized something that made him even more uncomfortable. Marcus wasn't just an accomplished musician. The way he had played, the level of skill and emotional depth he had displayed, that indicated someone who had been trained at the absolute highest level of classical music education. The salesman had just humiliated someone who had probably performed in major concert halls, who had studied with renowned teachers, who had devoted his entire life to an art form that the salesman pretended to respect but clearly didn't understand. "About our agreement," the salesman continued, swallowing hard. "You played the piece perfectly without a single error. By the terms of the deal I offered, I would sell you this piano for $150,000. Of course, I was not being serious. I never expected, I didn't think." He trailed off, realizing that every word he said was making things worse. "What I'm trying to say is that obviously you cannot afford to purchase this piano, so perhaps we could just forget the entire arrangement and—" "I'll take it," said a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was the elderly gentleman who had approached Marcus first. He was pulling a checkbook from his jacket pocket, and his expression was determined. "I'll purchase the piano for $150,000 exactly as you offered, and I'm giving it to this young man as a gift." The showroom erupted in gasps and excited chatter. The salesman's face went from red to white. "Mr. Rothstein, sir, I don't think you understand. I wasn't actually making a legitimate offer. It was just a joke, a way to call his bluff. I can't sell this piano for that price. I'll lose my job." "Mr. Rothstein," fixed the salesman with a cold stare that could have frozen water. "You made an offer in front of witnesses," he said, his voice hard. "This young man fulfilled every condition you specified. He played a piece all the way through without any errors. I recorded the entire conversation on my phone, including your exact words. You said if he could do this, you would sell him the piano for $150,000. Those were your terms, not his." The saleswoman stepped forward looking nervous. "Mr. Rothstein, with all due respect, my colleague wasn't authorized to make that kind of discount. The owner of the store would never approve it. Perhaps we could work out some other arrangement, but Mr. Rothstein was already writing a check." "I am a lawyer," he said calmly, not looking up from his checkbook. "I have practiced contract law in this city for 50 years. Your colleague made a verbal contract in front of multiple witnesses. If you attempt to back out of this agreement, I will personally ensure that this incident becomes very public, very quickly. I will contact every music publication in New York and tell them how one of the city's premier piano showrooms humiliated an extraordinary musician and then refused to honor their word when he proved them wrong. I wonder what that will do for your reputation. The room had gone completely silent again. The salesman looked like he might be sick. He glanced at his colleague, who could only shrug helplessly. They both knew they were trapped. Mr. Rothstein finished writing the check and held it out. $150,000, he said. Exactly as promised. Now I believe you have some paperwork to prepare for the delivery of this piano to wherever this young man lives. Marcus felt like he was watching all of this happen to someone else, like he had somehow stepped outside of his own body and was observing a scene from a movie. None of this made sense. An hour ago, he had been delivering packages in the rain, thinking about whether he had enough money left after rent to buy groceries for the next week. Now a stranger was buying him a piano worth more than he would earn in 5 years, and a crowd of people was treating him like he was someone important instead of invisible. "Sir," Marcus finally managed to say, turning to Mr. Rothstein, "I can't accept this. It's too much. I don't even have anywhere to put a piano. My apartment is barely big enough for a bed and a chair. This doesn't make any sense." Mr. Rothstein smiled at him kindly, and for a moment, Marcus saw something in the older man's eyes that reminded him of his grandmother. It was the look of someone who recognized potential and refused to see it wasted. "Young man," Mr. Rothstein said, "I made my fortune in law, but my first love was always music. I studied piano as a boy in Vienna before my family came to America. I was never particularly talented, but I learned enough to know real artistry when I hear it. What you just played was not simply technically proficient, it was transcendent. It was the kind of performance that reminds people why music matters." He paused and looked around the showroom at all the expensive pianos sitting unused, gathering dust between the occasional customer visit. "These instruments are meant to be played," he continued. "They are meant to make music, not sit in apartments as status symbols or investment pieces. I have wanted to do something meaningful with my money for a long time, something that would matter beyond just accumulating more wealth. Giving you this piano is not charity. It is an investment in art, in beauty, in the possibility that someone with your gift will share it with the world." The music producer stepped forward again, and I meant what I said about recording. "If you're worried about money, about making this work practically, I can help. We could start with some sessions at my studio just to see what happens. Classical music might not sell millions of copies, but there's absolutely a market for a pianist of your caliber. We could record some Chopin, some Liszt, build a portfolio. I know people at record labels, at concert halls. There are ways to make this sustainable." A woman who had been standing quietly in the crowd spoke up. She identified herself as a professor at Manhattan School of Music. "If you're interested in teaching," she said, "we're always looking for talented musicians to work with our students. The pay isn't extraordinary, but it's steady, and it would give you time to practice and develop your performance career. Someone with your skill and training could help shape the next generation of pianists." Marcus felt dizzy with all the possibilities suddenly opening up in front of him. For 3 years, his entire life had been reduced to surviving, to getting through each day, to pushing down any dreams that tried to surface because dreams were dangerous and painful. He had convinced himself that he was fine, that he had made his peace with being ordinary, with living a small life. But standing here in this showroom, surrounded by people who had just heard him play and recognized what he could do, he realized that he had been slowly dying inside, suffocating under the weight of all that unexpressed music. The salesman and saleswoman had retreated to the back office to process the paperwork, both of them looking like they had just survived a car accident. Marcus could see them through the glass window, the salesman on the phone, probably calling the store owner to explain what had happened and why they had just sold a $150,000 piano at a massive discount. The conversation looked heated, with the salesman gesturing frantically while the saleswoman stood by looking miserable. Mr. Rothstein handed Marcus a business card. "This has my personal phone number," he said. "Call me tomorrow. We'll discuss the delivery logistics and anything else you need. But more importantly, I want to help you figure out how to move forward from here. You clearly had serious training at some point. What happened? Why are you delivering packages instead of performing?" Marcus hesitated, not sure he wanted to explain his entire life story to a room full of strangers. But something about Mr. Rothstein's kind eyes and genuine interest made him feel safe enough to share at least the basic outline. "I was at Juilliard," he said quietly. "I had to leave to take care of my grandmother. After she died, I couldn't afford to go back. I've been working ever since trying to pay off the debts. I stopped playing because it hurt too much to remember what I'd given up." The elderly woman who had been crying earlier stepped forward and took Marcus's hand. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My son was a musician. He died in a car accident 5 years ago. Hearing you play today brought him back to me for those 10 minutes. That's the power of music, the power of what you can do. Please don't waste it. Please don't hide this gift because life got hard. Your grandmother sacrificed for you because she saw something special, and she was right." Marcus felt tears threatening again, but he pushed them back. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, though several people stopped to shake his hand or give him their contact information before they left. Everyone who spoke to him said essentially the same thing, that they had witnessed something remarkable, that they would never forget this moment, that he had a responsibility to keep playing because the world needed beauty and art and reminders of what human beings were capable of when they dedicated themselves to something higher than just survival. The music producer stayed behind with Mr. Rothstein, and the three of them moved to a quiet corner of the showroom to talk more seriously about what might happen next. The producer's name was David Chen, and despite sharing a last name with Marcus, they quickly established they weren't related. David pulled out his phone and started showing Marcus examples of classical recordings he had produced, explaining the kind of work they could potentially do together. "The thing is," David said, "classical music is actually having a bit of a renaissance right now, especially with younger audiences discovering it through social media and streaming platforms. There's this hunger for authentic, skilled performances that aren't overproduced or artificially enhanced. What you just played would get millions of views online. People are starving for real artistry in an age of manufactured pop stars and auto-tune. You could build a following pretty quickly if you wanted to." Mr. Rothstein nodded in agreement. "The challenge will be bridging the gap between where you are now and where you need to be financially to make this sustainable," he said. "You can't quit your jobs immediately without a safety net, but I have some ideas about that as well. I sit on the board of several arts foundations that provide grants to emerging artists. There are also private patrons in this city who support classical musicians. Let me make some calls." Marcus listened to them discuss his future like they were planning a military campaign, and part of him wanted to stop them, to tell them they were being unrealistic, that life didn't work this way, that delivery drivers didn't just suddenly become concert pianists because a stranger bought them a piano. But another part of him, the part that had been silent for 3 years, was waking up and screaming that this was his chance, that the universe had somehow conspired to put him in this exact place at this exact moment. And if he walked away now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The salesman emerged from the back office 20 minutes later, looking considerably older than he had when Marcus first walked into the showroom. He was carrying a folder full of paperwork and walking like someone heading toward his own execution. When he reached Marcus, Mr. Rothstein, and David, he set the folder down on a nearby table and took a deep breath before speaking. "I just spoke with the owner of the store," he said, his voice carefully controlled. As you might imagine, he was not pleased with the situation. "However, Mr. Rothstein is correct that I made a verbal contract in front of witnesses, and the legal implications of backing out would be worse than the financial loss. The piano is yours, or rather, it belongs to Mr. Rothstein, who is gifting it to you. We'll arrange delivery wherever you specify." He paused and looked directly at Marcus for the first time with something other than condescension or embarrassment. "I also wanted to apologize again, not because I'm legally required to, but because I genuinely am sorry. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and your job, and those assumptions were completely wrong. I've worked in this store for 15 years, and I've seen hundreds of people come through who bought expensive pianos as status symbols. People who could barely play chopsticks but wanted the prestige of owning a Steinway. I became cynical, and I stopped believing that real musicians even existed outside of concert halls and conservatories. You reminded me today why these instruments matter, and I'm sorry I tried to humiliate you." Marcus didn't know what to say. The apology seemed genuine, but it didn't erase the fact that this man had been prepared to mock him and throw him out of the store based purely on his appearance. Still, there was something to be said for someone who could admit they were wrong and genuinely try to make amends. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the apology without quite forgiving it yet. The saleswoman brought over a tablet and began going through the delivery details with Mr. Rothstein. They needed an address, a date for delivery, information about whether the building had elevator access, and whether the piano would fit through the doorways. It quickly became clear that Marcus's tiny studio apartment in Queens was not going to work. The piano was nearly 9 feet long and weighed close to 1,000 pounds. It would barely fit in most New York apartments, let alone one that cost Marcus half his monthly income. Mr. Rothstein waved away the concern. "We'll find appropriate space," he said. "In fact, I have a property in the Upper West Side that I've been considering selling. It's a brownstone with a large parlor floor that would be perfect for a piano like this. The market is slow right now anyway. Why don't we arrange for the piano to be delivered there temporarily? And we can figure out a longer-term solution once we have a better sense of how all of this is going to work. Marcus started to protest, but Mr. Rothstein held up his hand. Consider it a loan of the space, not a gift, he said firmly. You'll need somewhere to practice if you're going to develop your performance career, and you can't do that in a studio apartment with neighbors on all sides. Let me help you with this part. You can pay me back someday if it makes you feel better. But for now, let's just focus on getting you back to where you belong, which is making music. David pulled out his own calendar and started proposing dates for recording sessions. We could start with something relatively simple, he suggested. Record a few pieces that you already know well, get comfortable in the studio environment. Once we have some material, we can start shopping it around to labels and see what kind of interest there is. We should also film some of the sessions for content. Social media is huge for classical musicians right now. There's a pianist in South Korea who built an entire career through YouTube videos. We could do something similar. The conversation continued for another hour, with various people coming and going from the showroom, many of them still talking about the performance they had witnessed. The elderly woman gave Marcus her phone number and made him promise to let her know when he performed publicly so she could attend. The professor from Manhattan School of Music left her card and suggested he come by the school to meet some of the faculty and discuss potential teaching opportunities. By the time Marcus finally left the showroom, it was late afternoon and he had completely missed the rest of his delivery shift. His supervisor had probably tried to call him multiple times, though Marcus had silenced his phone during the piano performance and forgotten to turn the ringer back on. He would likely be fired from the courier job, and he needed to get to his dishwashing job at the restaurant in a few hours. But none of that seemed as important as it had this morning. Walking back out onto the Manhattan street, Marcus felt like he was moving through a dream. The same buildings and cars and people were there, but everything looked different somehow, brighter and more full of possibility. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the business cards that Mr. Rothstein and David and the professor had given him. These small pieces of paper represented doorways into a life he thought he had lost forever, and he was terrified of walking through them because what if it didn't work out? What if he failed? What if he got his hopes up only to have them crushed again? But he was also terrified of not walking through them, of going back to his 2 jobs and his tiny apartment and his life of just surviving. He had felt something today while playing that piano that he hadn't felt in 3 years. He had felt alive. He had felt like himself. And now that he remembered what that felt like, he didn't know if he could go back to sleepwalking through his days, pretending that he was fine with being less than he was capable of becoming. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he checked it, he saw 17 missed calls from his courier supervisor and a text message that said he was fired, effective immediately, for abandoning his route without notice. Marcus stared at the message and waited to feel the panic that should have come with losing half his income, but instead he felt something unexpected. He felt relief. One door had just slammed shut, which meant he could walk through a different one without looking back. 6 months later, Marcus stood backstage at Weil Recital Hall at Carnegie Hall, adjusting his bow tie and trying to calm his breathing. Through the curtain, he could hear the audience finding their seats, the rustle of programs, the low murmur of conversation. In 30 minutes, he would walk out onto that stage and perform his first major solo recital in 8 years. The program included the Chopin Ballade that he had played in the piano showroom, along with pieces by Rachmaninoff, Debussy, and Liszt. Every ticket had sold out within 48 hours of going on sale. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind that Marcus still barely believed was real. After leaving the piano showroom that day, he had called Mr. Rothstein the next morning, half expecting the whole thing to have been some kind of elaborate dream. But it wasn't a dream. Mr. Rothstein had the piano delivered to his brownstone within a week, and Marcus had spent every spare moment there practicing, relearning pieces he had once known by heart, and discovering that his hands remembered far more than he had thought possible. David had been true to his word about recording sessions. They had started with a few trial runs to get Marcus comfortable in the studio, and then they had recorded a complete album of Chopin works. David had sent the recordings to a friend at Deutsche Grammophon, one of the most prestigious classical music labels in the world, and within 2 weeks Marcus had a contract offer. The advance wasn't huge by pop music standards, but it was enough for Marcus to quit his dishwashing job and focus entirely on music. The professor from Manhattan School of Music had offered him a part-time position teaching advanced piano students, which provided steady income and forced Marcus to articulate the techniques and approaches that he had always known intuitively but had never had to explain. His students were talented and hungry to learn, and teaching them reminded Marcus of his own grandmother's patience and dedication when he was young. But the biggest surprise had come from social media. David had recorded several videos of Marcus playing in Mr. Rothstein's brownstone and posted them to YouTube and TikTok. Within days, they had gone viral. There was something about the combination of Marcus's backstory, his obvious skill, and the intimate setting of the videos that captured people's imagination. Comments poured in from around the world, from people who said his music had moved them to tears, who said they had rediscovered classical music through his performances, who said he had inspired them to pursue their own abandoned dreams. The story of what had happened in the piano showroom had leaked somehow, probably from one of the people who had witnessed it and recorded video on their phones. The video of Marcus playing the Chopin Ballade while wearing his delivery uniform had been viewed over 20 million times. Major news outlets had picked up the story, framing it as an inspiring tale about hidden talent and the importance of not judging people by their appearance. The piano showroom had tried to capitalize on the publicity, but the full video, including the salesman's condescending comments, had also gone public, resulting in a backlash that had ultimately cost the salesman his job. Marcus had mixed feelings about that. He hadn't wanted revenge, and he took no pleasure in knowing that someone had lost their livelihood because of him. But Mr. Rothstein had pointed out that the salesman had lost his job because of his own actions and attitudes, not because Marcus had played the piano. Still, Marcus had quietly reached out to the man months later and offered to write a letter of recommendation if it would help him find new employment. The salesman had been grateful and surprised, and they had ended up having coffee together, where the man admitted that being fired had actually forced him to confront his own bitterness and cynicism about life. Tonight's concert had been organized by Mr. Rothstein, who had called in favors from his extensive network of wealthy and influential New Yorkers who supported the arts. The tickets had been priced affordably, with the difference between the revenue and the hall rental cost covered by donations that Mr. Rothstein had personally solicited. He had insisted that Marcus's return to performing should be accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy elite who typically attended classical concerts. Standing backstage now, Marcus thought about his grandmother and wished desperately that she could be here to see this. She had always believed this day would come, even when Marcus himself had stopped believing. In some ways, he was grateful that she hadn't lived to see him deliver packages and wash dishes, that her last memories of him were as a promising young pianist at Juilliard. But he also wished she could see that her faith in him had been justified, that the sacrifices she had made hadn't been wasted, that the gift she had recognized in him when he was 5 years old had survived everything that life had thrown at them. There was a knock on the dressing room door and a stage manager poked her head in. 5 minutes, Mr. Chen, she said. Marcus nodded and took a final look at himself in the mirror. He was wearing a formal concert tuxedo that Mr. Rothstein had insisted on buying for him, and he looked like a completely different person from the exhausted delivery driver who had walked into that piano showroom 6 months ago. But he also looked like himself again, like the person he had been before grief and responsibility and survival had forced him to become someone smaller. He walked out into the wings and peered through the curtain at the audience. The hall was packed. He could see Mr. Rothstein sitting in the front row, and beside him was the elderly woman from the showroom who had told him about her son. David was there with his wife, and the professor from Manhattan School of Music had brought several of Marcus's students. But most of the audience were strangers, people who had bought tickets because they had seen his videos online or read about his story in the news, or simply wanted to hear good music performed by someone who genuinely loved it. The stage manager gave him the signal, and Marcus walked out onto the stage. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, and he stood at the piano for a moment, letting himself absorb the reality of where he was and what he was about to do. This was what his grandmother had dreamed of for him. This was what he had dreamed of for himself before life had taught him that dreams were dangerous. And now, against all odds, he was here. He sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The hall fell silent. Marcus closed his eyes for just a moment and sent a silent thank you to his grandmother wherever she was. Then he opened his eyes, took a breath, and began to play. The music poured out of him like water from a broken dam, years of unexpressed emotion and beauty flowing through his hands into the instrument and out into the hall. And in that moment, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was home. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Mistakes. Please double-check responses.